Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. We are at the Loft at the Algoma Conservatory of Music, and we are happy to welcome you and our live audience here for this edition of TVO Today Live. Our topic tonight, can angry people be good citizens? It's a question that cuts many ways, but tonight the spotlight is on citizens and how we treat each other, how we get things done in a democracy. This series, we should tell you, is made possible by the generous support of the Wilson Foundation so that we can explore vital issues facing our shared democratic institutions. Thank you, Red Wilson, so much for making this happen. And we are delighted to have 6 guests with us tonight who are going to contribute to this discussion. And they are Matthew Shoemaker. He is the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie. Sabrina Dellin, the CEO of the Samara Centre for Democracy. Joel Surrett, Director of Waakaa'igan and a part-time faculty member at Algoma University. Diane Kalen-Sukra, author of Save Your City, How Toxic Culture Kills Community and What to Do About It. She's also founder of the Kalen Academy, an online training institute for civic leaders. Michelle McCleave-Kennedy is here. She is the Sault Ste. Marie District Labour Council executive member and a vice president at the Ontario Federation of Labour. And Michael Friscolanti, but everybody calls him Frisco. And he's the editor-in-chief of Village Media, and I know you all want to join me in thanking them for being here this evening. So how about a round of applause? There we go. Thanks, guys. Diane, I want to start with you, and this may be a real dumb and obvious first question, but let's get back to first principles here. Why does the way citizens treat each other in a democracy matter?
Easy question. Well, it's a foundational concept. I mean, back to the ancient Greeks who founded democracy, they said that the city is what it is because the people are what they are. And a democracy can only be sustained with a certain political and civic culture. And if we inflict harm on one another, then we're just creating a sort of tyranny of your neighbor. Like, what's the point of getting rid of kings and queens if we don't treat each other with respect? And this, gets down to civility, and I know we may be talking about that a bit later.
We are, yeah. Sabrina, you spend a lot of time thinking about and talking to current and former parliamentarians about how we engage with each other. What would you add to that in terms of the importance of treating one another civilly in a democracy?
I mean, it's vitally important. I think, we're here because the dominant story right now is that democracy is under threat because anger is on the rise. And, from my view, a lot of that is shaped through an over-reliance on polling data to help us understand what's going on in our world. And there's a place for polls, absolutely, but it shouldn't be the only way that we make sense of what's going on. If you are asked over and over again, if you're feeling more polarized, if you feel like there's an increase in anger, if you feel like there's a sense of division between you and your neighbor, over time, you're going to feel like, yeah, maybe that is what's going on. I keep seeing it in the headlines, and maybe this is true. And I think we have more nuanced stories and research questions that we should be asking to make sense of what's really going on.
You think it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at a certain point?
Well, imagine if instead of being asked if you're feeling more polarized, if you were asked if you'd be interested in supporting the common good in Canada.
Oh, do pollsters ever ask that?
No, and guess what? Nuanced, solutions-oriented research done by nonprofit organizations doesn't get the same attention because it's expensive and it takes a lot of time. And Joel, that's something that matters.
Sorry. How do you see this, Joel?
Yeah, I think different things mean different things to different people. And I think the first question is, why are people angry? But also, I think it's a reflection of the larger culture that we are within, and people that are of different communities, different groups, different marginalized groups, they have different experiences through their own lived experience. And I think, to say people are generally angry, I think there are different reasons for different people.
Well, I think it's fair to say we spend a lot of time thinking about why we're angry at politicians. But I think, Michelle, you can probably take us beyond that. You've got some information about nurses, teachers. There are others who are facing anger out there as well. For example.
So we're seeing a lot of violence in public sector jobs. So, I mean, the most injured group of workers right now is teachers, education workers, nurses, anyone who's working public service, store people. And we're seeing a lot of mental health and addictions and issues surrounding that. So people are feeling, they're feeling angry, and they're having difficulty trying to make ends meet. And we're seeing that in people that are working in public sector. And they're the most injured group that we're seeing currently in our communities.
Frisco, follow up on that if you would. If so many people are angry, what are they angry about?
Well, I think Joel hit on the important question. There's so many different things that people are angry about, whether it's the cost of living, whether it's their own health, their lack of being able to find a doctor, for example. There's so many things that bring people to the table of why they're upset. And then that frustration sort of manifests itself, right? And you know, from my perspective in the world of journalism, for us it's difficult because we want to cover this anger. We want to tell people the stories about what's upsetting them, what's the reason for why this is happening. But we have to walk that fine line too about not inflaming people's anger. So that's kind of the balance we walk on as well with that issue.
Mayor Shoemaker, I wonder if you have noticed during your time in office a difference between the kind of anger you might have seen pre-COVID versus post-COVID. Is there a difference?
Yeah, I think the difference is probably in what COVID did to our society. Made things more expensive, felt like things were getting more out of reach in terms of housing, in terms of grocery bills, and really amplified, or at least brought to the surface, issues of mental health and addictions that I think were there, but have now, you know, been borne out for all to see. And the solutions seem to be further away than ever because the growth, well, you know, for many reasons, but I think the growth in investment from all levels of government has not kept up with the pace of the growth of the problem. So there was definitely a shift in March of 2020, and probably there was a bit of goodwill there and communal coming together for a time being. And then as it dragged on, the pandemic, there was a definite shift in public sentiment and public discourse, I think, from that point forward that we haven't gotten back to.
Let me do a follow-up with you, because there was this line that we're all in it together, right? We all heard this during COVID. We're all in it together. It's affecting us all the same way, except not really, right? You could see it presumably from your perch that some groups were disproportionately affected compared to others, right? Fair to say?
Fair to say some groups were disproportionately affected. Also fair to say that at some point the all in it together line became, tired, I would say, as the lockdowns extended beyond what people expected, because we were being told that, you know, within a month or within 2 weeks, everyone will be back to the office. A year and a half later, that was still, you know, on and off kind of thing, and people were growing frustrated with the problem. I can appreciate that there was frustration out there with a lack of clarity. I can also see the flip side of the coin on the governing side, which is how do you ensure that you're keeping your residents as safe as possible when you don't know what the consequences of this is if you open everything up all at once. So there's as my colleague here said, nuance in these decisions, and probably the balance was somewhere in between where it ultimately landed.
Joel, when you heard people say we're all in it together, what did you think?
Well, I think back to some of the things that had happened in, you know, the Ojibwe community, and sadly, you know, in many communities, a lot of language speakers were lost. But I think an interesting case study is focusing on an Ojibwe community, the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. They came together and they did a lot of work around language revitalization. And one of the language speakers from that community, he's a ceremonial leader, very well respected. And the pandemic was incredibly hard. You know, he lost his sister, he lost his brother, from what I'm told. And you know, through people that have really worked on the Ojibwe Rosetta Stone project, you know, he said COVID was incredibly difficult, but, you know, I tell you, that was one of the best times in my life because we came together, we were speaking language, we were working with people. And again, I think it goes back to that idea that everybody has had a different experience through that. So, you know, some people had incredibly challenging times, and, you know, in terms of what was happening in some communities around language revitalization, they saw that as a really positive time because it was a time where they could actually work on that revitalization project.
Frisco, did you see a watershed when COVID hit?
I think we saw that same transition, and I almost feel like we've gone so far the other way now. We were all in it together then, and I feel like we're all in for ourselves now. That's the society we live in today, and I don't know. You know, we always try to find these dots to connect, right? But you see it in the community we live in now. There's so many great things about Sault Ste. Marie that make the people wonderful and people come together. But you also see the stories about how there's not enough volunteers for kids sporting organizations, or there's not enough volunteers for Meals on Wheels. I mean, they need to come out and say, we're going to close Meals on Wheels. Of all places, of all things, right? So I do wonder sometimes if we've gone too far the other way, and does anyone even care anymore about the sense of community, the sense of doing something for the better of other people? I mean, you're seeing a lot of signs of that not being around.
Diane, can you pick up on that? Do you think we are fraying at the edges in terms of our sense of community these days?
Well, we definitely are, but I do feel that there is something in the human spirit that will seek for answers and that we are looking towards each other. There is increasing levels of consciousness around the fragmentation in society and the atomization. I think that we're tired of this transactional culture, which I think is part of, Michelle's point. It seems that our socialization process that produced good citizens is broken. That what we've produced instead is wonderful consumers that shop well as a virtue, right? And yet the virtue of loving your neighbor and wishing your neighbor well, we see a lot of ill will in the public square. And it's very divisive. In fact, the very word toxic comes from the ancient Greek word for arrow. So the more toxic a community is, the more arrows there are out there. People are piercing each other, right? And this makes it very difficult to collaborate and cooperate to resolve the big issues that our communities are facing. And I frankly believe that the line, like, incivility has been rising for years now, probably decades, but we haven't seen the impact in our communities. Like the material impact is very apparent. It starts to show up immediately, like with our elected officials. You start to see abuse and intimidation on the rise. You start to see local governments facing dysfunction, paralysis, can't make governance decisions. So they can't even make decisions to resolve issues. You have governance collapse. And once we're in that kind of crumbling situation, it requires so much energy to try and repair it. So negative actions actually produce a very negative culture, a fear-based culture that is totally incompatible with local democracy and the kind of spirit, the kind of ethos that we need to work together to address our very pressing human issues.
Sabrina, I wonder how you feel when you hear the people in this room referred to as taxpayers or consumers, but rarely as citizens.
Yeah.
How does that rub you?
Well, talking about what happened during the pandemic and the fact that we're still recovering from it, what we saw during that period was, school closures for over 2 years, intermittent, and a shrinking of third spaces where people can go, where they're not a worker and they're not a consumer. They can just be there to connect with other people or maybe collectively solve a problem. And I think what's accelerated this tension and unease and anxiety is the fact that during that period we also went online a lot more and on social media platforms that have content recommendation systems that fuel something that's called affective polarization, which makes you feel like there is division between you and someone else, that makes you have a negative association if someone has a different political bent than you do. But when it comes down to substantive issues, you're actually not that far apart. And in a recent Samara Centre report, we track online abuse received by candidates in Canadian elections. And one of our recent findings is that it's a small number of users that end up posting a large amount of the awful, abusive, toxic content. But when it's all coming at you through these content recommendation systems, it's out of proportion. So between this kind of wild reality online that's shaping our sense of what's happening in real life and can manifest in violence in real life, and online abuse is still abuse, I'm sure Mayor Shoemaker agrees, that plus these kind of narrow polling questions is really like putting us in a very dark space when there are other stories we can tell about how healthy our communities are, but it's such a fight to get out of this kind of darkness.
Well, we've got somebody sitting on this group here who has run for office a few times and has no doubt run into this kind of crap. You want to tell us?
I mean, the fight in our community is certainly there, and we see that with services. And as we've talked about, the understaffing of different services, people are exhausted. They don't have the time. I mean, we've had many rallies in this community over healthcare and the shortage of doctors and many, many other issues. But yeah, there's certainly, it's pulling people and getting people to still want to volunteer and be there and have those conversations and not be so negative. But you are right. There is a lot of negativity that does come out of that. But then in a smaller community as this, there's a real community base to pull people back together. And there's a real sense of community over, as Mike said, with our Y closing and various other things, people have really come together.
We're going to pick up on that in a second. The possibility that the YMCA here in Sault Ste. Marie was going to close. Some citizens got angry. They did something about it. Well, I was going to say no spoilers, but I guess we can spoil it. They saved it. But we'll tell you why in a second. I actually want to ask this audience a question, which is, sorry, this is a pollster's question. Here we go. Polera, which is a polling organization, they released what they called their Rage Index. And they compared how sort of angry citizens were across the country. Do you want to take a guess which province was #1 in terms of highest on the Rage Index? Ontario. You're all saying Ontario. Yeah, Ontario. Ontario was the angriest towards all levels of government. They also track things such as road rage, for example. I heard a little twitter of laughter there, and I think that's because I'm going to poll this audience right now. How many people here say they have either witnessed this kind of public anger, be it road rage or something else, or have yourselves lost your cool in public at some time? Can I see a show of hands on that, please? Okay. Well, what was interesting there was we had a few honest people put their hands up instantly, and then the rest of you put it up eventually, which we kind of figured was going to happen. Yeah, this seems to be a thing, Mayor Shoemaker. We seem to be very angry these days. I wonder if any of that surprises you.
It doesn't, but I think, you know, I hate to, blame the anger on the anger, right? The anger is rooted in something. It's rooted in inability to, I've mentioned it, the feeling that the cost of housing is getting away from people, the feeling that life is more unaffordable than it ever has been. So I think there is value to a certain degree in assessing what the levels of anger are, so that you can then try and understand how to try and resolve the issues that are causing that anger. I don't think we necessarily ought to be dismissive of something because it's called the Rage Index. It's a cheeky name, but I think there's value in trying to get to what is causing people to be frustrated, so that you can try and work on a solution. You know who Allie Denny is? Yes, I do. I bet you do. Okay, where's Allie? You're right over here? Okay, hang on. I'm going to come into the audience here and talk to Allie for a second because, good, you've got your microphone. Yes. You heard the YMCA was going to be shut down in this city. Mm-hmm. Hold the mic nice and close and tell us what you thought when you heard that might happen.
Well, I will say I think anger being the topic of the night is something that galvanized myself and everybody else to go along with that. I think there is a place for anger in our community. I mean, it's what sparks everything going. So if you're mad, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to go on social media and blast the comment sections? Or are you going to speak to your community, try to galvanize them to come together, work with our elected officials, reach out to our MPs, get on the news and talk about it? Or are we just going to sit behind our computers? But if I understand you properly, the first reaction you had was anger. Anger and sadness. I'm sure everybody's seen the Sault Today photo. That was their stock Allie Denny photo for a little bit. It's been replaced since, but... describe it for those who haven't seen it. No, I'm good. No? We don't need a replay. But yeah, everybody in the room, myself included, it was a sense of devastation. That's been a staple in our community, a place where people can gather and, like the panel had said, just be a community together. But this was a case where it wasn't just anger for anger's sake. I presume it was anger towards coming up with some kind of constructive action to save the place. Absolutely. And you did that. I did.
How'd you do it?
I mean, the Facebook group was a really great start. I just made the group that night, invited my whole friends list, and my couple admins, they invited their whole friends list, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
How many people did you end up getting on it?
3,300. It dwindled down to 3,200 after the Y was saved, but...
And how do you, what was decisive here? I mean, lots of citizens get together to try to protest, to try to have something good come out of it. A lot of them lose, right? A lot of times it just doesn't happen. Why did it happen in this case?
I think in this case, it wasn't just that the people that are members of the Y were upset, like, oh, I'm losing where I work out, I'm losing this, I'm losing that. The binding factor to it all was that the community is losing this. We need this for our kids. We need to come together to save it. It wasn't just one person being angry and mad about it, you know?
Do you know if you've saved it for good or for now?
I've been having to brush up on my bureaucracy and that type of jargon, but I think so. And I will say as well, I'm not disillusioned to the fact that it was the Facebook group that did everything, but we did have a buyer step up. The city was a great help in pairing with them in the working group. So as of now, I think, safe to say, I think it's saved.
Should we ask the mayor and find out?
Yeah, ask
Let's
him.
find out.
Yeah,
Let's find out. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That was great. How about a hand for Ali? Very good. Okay. Okay. Well, okay, Mayor Shoemaker. Did she save it for now or for good?
Well, I think for the foreseeable future, provided there are some hurdles to get over still. I don't want to give the illusion that it's all signed, sealed, and delivered. It isn't yet. There are steps that need to be taken, including the community buying memberships in the Y. So I'll put a plug in for that because it is a critical aspect of ensuring the sustainability of the organization over the long term. But what I think, she's not giving herself enough credit. But what Ali and the group, the Save the YMCA group, did was galvanized community support to such a point that it became obvious to everybody and people who had the ability to help out that this was something worth doing. And so, it would have been easy to be angry about this and to simply go on Facebook and rant and rave, but they were able to coalesce community support as opposed to community anger around it. And it may have initially been anger, but as they, I think, realized that, I'm hypothesizing what happened here, as they realized that there was enough of a groundswell of support here that they could make a difference, they held the town hall here next door at the machine shop, and it really gave not just council a sense, because council only, is an intermediary in this process, but gave the folks, the foundation, the charitable foundation that ended up putting up the funds to buy the place, and the users of the Wise End services, the ability to come together and say, here is the roadmap we need to save it, and they did a great job at that.
Frisco, Village Media covered this. What do you think?
We did, and I think that's part of what Ali said, is that the fact that it received so much attention that the average person in the community was upset. But what's interesting is there's a lot of anger now on the other side. There's a lot of taxpayers in this community that don't think that they think council made a mistake, that they put up $500,000, right, of taxpayer money toward this plan to save the Y. And if you look at polling done by our polling system, the vast majority of people in the Sioux don't agree that this was a good idea. But what was interesting as well, and what I think goes to that issue of curbing people's anger, is that if you actually watched the council debate and you took the time to pay attention, it was a rational, reasonable debate. The city councilors who agreed with it basically said, if we don't spend this $500,000 here and this building shuts down, we're out of millions and other services we're going to have to provide if we don't do this. So even though some city councilors, I don't want to speak for Mayor Shoemaker, but some city councilors didn't maybe want to spend that money, they knew that the alternative was way, way worse. And when you put it to people that way, it's a lot more palatable. You can understand it in that way. So, but I don't know, there's maybe 30, 40 people watching the YouTube stream of city council, so that those angry people that voted in the poll aren't necessarily paying attention to those details.
Are your ratings that bad? You only got 30, 40 people watching? Is that true?
That's the YouTube stream.
Oh, the YouTube.
The cable stream is through the roof.
The cable stream is through the roof, I see. Now, tell me, is this a story about citizens coming together for a constructive purpose, channeling their anger and getting a good result? Or is this the squeaky wheel getting the grease, and actually most people aren't in favor of this? Do we know? Yeah, yeah, I'm looking at you.
I'm listening to this story. I'm still focused on the good news part, and I really want to focus on it because it's so rare that we see citizen action directed so constructively. And I think Mayor Shoemaker is correct in saying that she did not act in a moment of anger, and that's the key, not to act when you're angry. And this issue of anger in the public square has been central to political thinkers, civic leaders, political philosophers for as long as we've lived in communities. And, for instance, the Stoics felt that anger is so dangerous that they said it's a plague that has caused more death than any other human suffering, that it's caused the end of cities and civilizations. And so it's so important not to react, but to actually respond. And what she did was respond really intelligently. And there is this very well laid out litmus test for constructive anger that comes to us from classical antiquity. And she's mastered it. Like, the first one is to rightfully respond. So rightfully determine who is responsible. She went to the right parties. Like we see a lot today in the public square, people, for instance, just blaming absolutely everything on the Prime Minister, which is clearly not possible, right? And dishonest, actually. Or a rightful purpose. Her purpose was for the community. It wasn't ill will. It wasn't because she wanted to make sure someone didn't get a pension. That's why, because she's jealous. It's not coming out of negative emotion, right? It's properly purposed. It was done to the right degree, so there wasn't some there was a proportionate response to what was happening. It was timely. It was done at the right time. Sometimes, it's important to act at the right time, and that was done correctly. And the way in which it was done collaboratively, together with the city, not just raising more animosity and rage farming and more, feeling more like a victim. It was very empowering, a beautiful example for the community, and how the community responds to it in the end. Like, sometimes there's an initial reaction, and then people see, oh, it is actually a good thing, right? This happens all the time. And so it's my hope that that ends up being the outcome.
Michelle, how about you? How do you see it?
For our community, it's definitely a step in the right direction. It would have put a lot of families without daycare, which certainly would have added to a lot of the issues that we're seeing in our community, a lot of stress.
The notion that anger can be a positive thing when channeled constructively.
It can definitely be positive. We've had a lot of energy over the doctor shortage here in Sault Ste. Marie. We lost 10,000 patients, lost doctors in the last few months. And it's been a definite positive reaction from folks coming together, telling their stories, writing to different levels of government and trying to get things going. So if it's channeled in the right way, yes, anger is a good force to bring people together and come up with some solutions to some of the situations that we have.
Sabrina, how about the anger you see at Queen's Park, for example, or on Parliament Hill? Now, is that the same kind of constructively channeled anger resulting in citizens coming together for a greater purpose? Do you see much of that?
Well, what we're exploring is that there is a purpose for anger. It can, motivate political action. It can spur political change. It can be that thing that sparks a social movement and brings a community together. But we want to see that anger being used in a productive way. And where are we seeing that modeled? I would say not question period necessarily, where we are seeing increasingly our parliamentarians kind of looking for social media clips that they can use for engagement. And
that's monetizing anger, isn't it?
Absolutely, right? And then that goes back to those content recommendation systems that are amplifying harmful content in a way that's out of proportion to our real life. And the fact is, we are onto them. We know what they're doing, and it's, we're not impressed. And we know from hearing from teachers, they're actually embarrassed to take their students to question period on tours because they don't want to expose young people to that type of behavior. But on the flip side, we want more stories like about Ali, for instance, where that anger is turned into something productive and even, complex as we're exploring.
Okay, we're about the midway point here, and I guess this is a good time to just sort of remind everybody where we are and what we're doing. We're in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, at the Loft of the Algoma Conservatory of Music, and we're talking about angry people and democracy with Matthew Shoemaker, he's the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie, Sabrina Dellon, CEO of the Samara Centre for Democracy, Joel Surrett, director of Waakaa'igan, Diane Kalen-Sukra, author of Save Your City, Michelle McCleave-Kennedy, executive member of the Sault Ste. Marie District Labour Council, and Michael Friscolanti, who's the editor-in-chief of Village Media. Okay, where do we want to pick up from here? there have been lots of references to the anger we see on social media as being perhaps distinct from the anger that Ali experienced when she was trying to save the Y. And Diane, maybe you could pick up on that. Do you see any of the anger on social media that we run into far too much as having any constructive purpose whatsoever? Because I don't know, sometimes from my vantage point, it just looks like it's a cesspool. I don't see the constructive nature of it all, but maybe I'm not looking in the right places. What do you see?
Well, Ali did use social media constructively, so it can be used constructively. I think that, there is definitely something happening with people's brain chemicals in terms of activating. Like, it's almost like that they think that civic engagement is just getting outraged about everything, and then it's kind of creating like a traumatized response. And so I do think that social media can be used positively, but like people in a community, for instance, before making a bylaw complaint or talking to their neighbor first before making a bylaw complaint, instead going on social media and shaming their neighbor, that's very destructive behavior in a community. It breaches human bonds of trust and social cohesion, which is actually everybody loses, because we know that trust and cohesion are the two elements that makes communities resilient. And so even if the world is turbulent, the global markets, and we don't know what's going on in a community, you can still shore yourself up by building up trust and cohesion. And destructive behaviors on social media, go against that. But I have to say, I have seen people intervene in very toxic conversations, people, who may just speak the truth, and it can have a huge impact. So I encourage people to be upstanders. Don't just sit and watch those things play out, but in fact speak out and, for
Get
justice.
involved.
Get involved, yeah.
Joel, how do you see it?
Yeah, I think it's to an idea where we can be part of the solution or we can perpetuate the problem. And, from the lens of social media, it's amazing how many people don't actually read an article through and, post an opinion, or they're in the comment section. But, this had been mentioned earlier, and I think part of this is a long time coming, because we have collective and we have conscious choice of what we give our time and attention to. And to go back kind of pre-pandemic, and I think this is a larger, structure that's at play in the larger system. So pre-pandemic, we were looking at Trans Mountain, and Trans Mountain was a super controversial issue. And here in our own community, there was a group of people exercising their right to protest, and they decided to block the front entrance to the International Bridge to draw attention to the issue. And what was communicated, nationally through media, through legacy media, is that, Indians are anti-pipeline, right? And I still say Indian because back in the 80s, it's what we called ourselves. We signed our treaties under that term. But, Indians are anti-pipeline, they're protesting, they're angry. And like that type of statement, again, it's harmful for one, because when you look at the larger landscape, you have several communities, and many in the Western provinces are actually for pipelines. But what wasn't communicated is that there were 3 additional routes that were proposed for Trans Mountain. And they were opposed to one of those routes that went through a very significant part of their territory. And I think, again, it's a part of a larger symptom, because we have conscious choice of what we give our time and attention to, our collective thinking, but also how we communicate that, right? And even that term anger, it's like there are things in our community that we should be angry over. There are things where we have people who are going through really hard times, and that should make us angry, because those are some of our most vulnerable people. But the response shouldn't be, blasting on social media, because to me that perpetuates the problem as opposed to stepping up and being part of the solution.
Well, let me ask Frisco about that. I presume, well, I shouldn't presume. Do you have on your website a comment section for people to weigh in? And do you from time to time have to turn it off because it gets too angry?
We do. We have kind of a legendary comment system at Sault Today, long before I was here. But we have a system now called verified commenting, and it's you get a blue check mark basically, which means we trust you to not be vicious to each other, to be civil, to not be racist, to not accuse people of wrongdoing in the comments. So we trust in the middle of the night, if you post a comment under the story, we trust you. One strike, you're gone if you put something in. But then we still have moderation in place. But we do have rules where there are certain stories we don't allow commenting at all, whether it's a crime story, those kinds, whether it's an Indigenous story, because we have seen and we've editorialized about this, the racism that comes out in those stories, whether it's even just a positive story about a new way of providing housing in a community, for example, can trigger horrific things. And we've seen that. We've editorialized about it, we've talked about it, and so we don't allow comments on those because it sadly brings out the worst people, and they come out fast and furious.
Does the mayor have a website that allows comments or emails that you have to peruse?
So on anything that I post on Facebook, folks often comment on. I've got a team at City Hall, including myself, that do have to moderate those to some degree. Occasionally block people, occasionally delete the comments. I mean, it gets out of hand. For the most part, I would say 95% of the posts are completely civil, and the comments are disagree. I don't care if someone disagrees with the issue. I don't mean I don't care about it. I mean, I don't delete that if someone disagrees with the issue. But if someone is going after another poster or posting something inappropriate under the comments section that someone else, in reply to someone else, sometimes it takes moderation and curation.
You really think 95% of the people are okay when they weigh in?
Well, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I think 95% of comments, even if they disagree with the post itself, are doing it in a way that doesn't warrant being hidden or being deleted or being blocked. But there is probably 5% of folks that really go too far, or all those things that Frisco mentioned: racist, inappropriate, accusatory of illegal activities, like that type of thing gets deleted.
I want to give the audience a heads up. We'll do a couple of more questions up here, and then it will be your turn. We want to hear your questions for our guests here today, so start the wheels in motion, and we'll be out to you in just a second. I wonder if there is a bit, I don't know, Sabrina, let me go to you on this one. I wonder how much out there we see, I know what my rights are, damn it, and I don't necessarily think a lot about my obligations to the community or to society, but I know what my rights are. How much of that is playing out in this drama that we're talking about here?
I think we're exploring how the dominant story is that things aren't working, everything is terrible, and it's not, democracy is really in a bad place. And when that's the dominant story, it's really easy to lose sight of what is working, what is good, and what's vital to protect. And we're having a bit of a flattening of the citizen experience where we can only understand, in this kind of like very tense binary moment, citizens as either apathetic or angry. Neither one of those is a very productive, collaborative, or innovative space from which to come up with solutions for the problems that we have right now. There are compelling, courageous, and ambitious stories about people who are strengthening democracy, but we just don't get to hear them very much, which is a factor of a decline in support for journalism, which is terrible. And, here are just two examples from around the world right now. In Poland, it was women that mobilized to defeat the authoritarian Law and Justice Party. And we have seen in the United States a record number of women candidates running in response to laws that are restricting their bodily autonomy. Those aren't dominant stories in our understanding of democracy right now. The constant headline is democracy under threat, abuse, hatred everywhere. Anger is there, it's real. What's underpinning that? It's fear, it's insecurity, and it's us still recovering from the pandemic and understanding how to even be together. And this sense of also intimidation and boredom when it comes to political conversations.
Well, let me follow up with Michelle on that. Which concerns you more? Is it the anger that sometimes doesn't feel constructive and in fact can be very hurtful? Or is it the apathy that led more than half the people not to vote in the last provincial election?
Yeah, I mean, it's both. The apathy for sure. But as we talked about here, it's people not understanding the issues. And as Joel said, they take a bit of the headline, don't read the whole story, and then don't understand the issues that are going on. And I mean, we see it all the time. We could talk about issues of understaffing across many, many public sectors, education, healthcare, and workers are getting burnt out. But it's the same thing. We're not seeing the issues. We're only seeing a small fraction of the headline, and it's not being picked up by people and talked about. And I mean, most of the areas that we're seeing that are underserviced right now are underserviced through lack of funding. And it's mostly female-dominated fields. And so, you know, to that point, there's a lot of people that feel that, you know, they're just disjointed, and poverty, housing, we're keeping people so busy with trying to just make things meet that they don't have time to sit and look at what the issues are and read the whole story and actually have a conversation with folks that is positively moving to make solutions.
Do we want to build a bit of a list here? Maybe, Diane, you could get us started on how we stop being so unconstructively angry and just sort of toxic versus constructive anger that leads to a kind of a positive outcome. What do we need to do?
Yeah, I think Joel actually pointed to the key point. We have a choice. We can make a choice. We can make individual choices. We can make social choices. We can make collaborative change. And, you know, one of the issues that you raised, this issue of maybe knowing our rights but not our responsibilities, there was actually a survey that came out earlier this year. I think it was from Civics Canada and Abacus, and it found that a third of Canadians don't remember having any civics education, and almost a majority, I believe, it was who don't remember learning anything about their responsibilities. It's something like 75 their civic responsibilities. Never heard that they had them, and then for teachers, something like 78% of teachers had not been trained themselves ever in teaching school to teach civics. So it's not part of the integrated program, right? And so to expect people who are absolutely, I mean, people are in survival mode and barely have time. And so at the least we could do is shore up their skills. And there are many ways to do that. Now, obviously, we're not going to have like a national revolution in civic education, but there are things that we can do within our community. There are things that local governments can do to, you know, sort of citizen academies, integrate people, use every opportunity of communication as an education, as an empowerment. It's time, I believe, to build people up and to be mutually supportive of each other. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but it certainly, I think, addresses some of the issues we've been...
It's getting there. And since you said maybe it's up to some municipal people to help out there, I happen to have one right here. Do you see that as part of your responsibilities as the mayor of this community?
I'm eager to engage on that aspect of it because I got a lot out of my civics education. So I had excellent civics education in grade 5 and grade 10 that turned me on to politics, and it's something that has stayed with me forever, and I've been interested in it ever since. So I want to be able to, you know, help people get engaged in topics that interest them. Another one, as you know, is William Hearst, that I've become very interested in.
Tell the people who he was.
William Hearst, Premier from Sault Ste. Marie, 7th Premier of Ontario, first Premier from Northern Ontario, and had a bunch of accomplishments as well. But when you become engaged in an issue, you want to get other people engaged in that issue as well. And I've become engaged in politics, and I want other people to become engaged in politics because I think there is good value to being an involved community member, giving back to the community that's given you so much. You know, my mom was born on a dirt floor in Italy.
Where is she?
She's just over here. And
there she is, right there.
She immigrated to Canada in 1969. Her parents stayed in Italy and lived there the rest of their lives until they died. And within one generation, the city that adopted her gave her and my parents and ourselves the opportunity for me to become the mayor of the city. So within one generation, that opportunity was passed down to me from my community, and so this is my way, I think, of giving back to the community that has given me and my family so much.
Since you mentioned Premier Hearst, we need to do a little nerd aside here, okay? I don't think we did it on the last time you were in Toronto, but 2 times ago, when His Worship came to Toronto, we saw each other, and do you know what we did when we were in Toronto? We visited Hearst's gravesite. That's how much of a nerd this guy is for Hearst, okay? We actually went to his gravesite, which was about a 20-minute walk from TVO. Yep. It was very close. Yep. So you came in for your interview, and then we walked down to Hearst's gravesite and took a bunch of pictures there, and that was arguably the greatest day of your life.
Well, I mean, I've got 2 kids and a wife that would beg to differ, but yeah.
I don't know. I think the Hearst gravesite was a pretty important thing for you. Yeah, I don't know. I think so. Okay, who's going to pick Frisco?
I thought you were going to ask if provincial politics was in his future. That's what I thought you were going to ask.
Well, we can get to that later, but it's all right. It's all right. We're going to put something on that list. Put something else on that list of what we need to do to make sure it's constructive anger and not just the typical toxic BS.
I think this is total wishful thinking, but I think it's really on individuals to try to ask themselves, to try to figure out, why is this person so against the way I think? Why does this person believe the things they believe or think the way they think? You know, as a journalist, we often get times to dig deep on a story and speak to many, many people involved with an incident that happened or something that happened. And in the end, you realize that you understand why everybody feels the way they feel. There's a reason. There's something that happened in their past. There's something that happened to someone they love, or something that happened to them, or something they experienced. That's why they feel the way. And I know you mentioned how busy we are in the world we live in, just trying to get by. It's hard for us to take on that individual responsibility, but I think it is important for us to, if you really encounter someone who is so against the way you think, what you believe, try to find out why they think like that.
Mm-hmm. You want to pick up on that?
Well, I mean, I think there needs to be, if we want a vibrant culture of civic engagement in Canada, we have to support an abundance of civic opportunity for people so that they don't just feel like, oh, now you have to vote or you need to run. These are the only options as a citizen. And we need to really legitimize all the different ways that people are active and contributing in their community, and help them understand that if you didn't grow up talking about politics at the dinner table, if you did poorly in your civic course, it's not too late. You can get onto the path to being an active citizen at any point. You can fall off and you can come back. We also need a national imperative where digital media literacy in schools would make a massive difference, and that should be something that we take pride in, that helps us evolve as a country for the 21st century, and then of course platform accountability on top of that.
Okay, we have, where are the microphones here? I see one here. Is there another one, or that's it? That's it. This is the one microphone here. So if you've got a question, and I know this is a Canadian audience and nobody wants to go first, but if you've got a question, please come to the microphones here and we will be happy to take your questions here. I wonder if it's, and just as we wait for the lineup to start here, I wonder, Joel, is it different in the Indigenous world in this country?
Well, again, I'm one person, so I don't speak on behalf of the entire Indigenous community. But I will say this, you know, and to Mayor Shoemaker's point, I think we can draw from really wonderful examples in our own community. And if I go back to the time of 2008, the national apology, and it wasn't the goodwill of the Prime Minister at the time, it was court mandated. And it was the largest class action settlement in Canadian history at the time. And we were witness to an incredible group of people who had every right to be angry, and yet took a portion of that, and that led to the National Aboriginal Healing Foundation, that gave us the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it gave us the 94 calls to action. And why I say that in a localized context, what a lot of people don't know in Sault Ste. Marie is the very first survivor reunion gathering that we know of that happened anywhere in the country, happened right here in our community, the front steps of Algoma University, and a group of people who had come back, and the first thing that they did, they rolled up their sleeves, they went and they cleaned up the graveyard, and they continued in the work. And today we have elders who are in their 80s who are continuing to work in making our community a better place. They're not angry. They want to tell the stories, and they want to tell all people of their stories. Some have had very, hard experiences, very, traumatic experiences. And others will talk about, some of the things that they enjoyed in their time there in residential school. And that happens on the daily in our community. We have an incredible group of people, and I think we can draw a lot of strength, a lot of wisdom from many people who are in our local community. And I always say Sault Ste. Marie is one of the best places in terms of not talking about itself. We were talking about public education. And, I laughed when you talked about civics, because that's always, the course the novice teacher gets because nobody wants to teach it. Yet, one of the probably most important courses, but what's not known, and another example of Sault Ste. Marie, we have, native language, we have Indigenous language in Ontario curriculum That also started here in Sault Ste. Marie. You saw a group of women who came together, adapted a French curriculum, and started to teach language, to Ojibwe children. So I think we can draw strength from those who come before us. And I always say, in this work, we really do walk in the footsteps of giants if we look to those that came before us.
Wonderfully said. Okay, you are the brave soul who is going to get us started here today. If you feel like it, give us your first name, where you're from, and fire away.
My name's Riley.
Hi, Riley.
I'm from Sault Ste. Marie.
Okay.
And my question has to do with, so we've been talking a lot about economic issues leading to anger. And I was wondering, do you guys think it's more that it's actual cultural differences between people's viewpoints that is leading to the anger, especially online and towards politicians?
Anybody in particular you want to focus this on?
I guess the mayor.
It's an interesting question. I don't know that I've got the answer to it, but I think that you can look at a time in history. I know the example from Sault Ste. Marie because I've heard it growing up, where there was division between the traditional WASP population here and the burgeoning Italian community that was established here kind of around the time of post-Second World War. And there is now, the Italian community has become so fundamental in the makeup of the community that you often see immigrants who have come from Italy and are looking at newcomers, recent newcomers to Canada, saying, well, I wish I had this when I had come to the country. So that happens.
Is that okay to say?
I've heard it from relatives. I'll say it's not my mom because I pointed out that she's an immigrant earlier. I've heard it from relatives, but I like to remind them that when they came here, it was a different time and they were not treated in the way that they are currently, treating others. So it's important. They would have wished at that time that they had been treated with more respect. And so I remind them to treat, those newcomers with more respect. So it could be that there is a reincarnation of those types of sentiments that have been experienced historically.
While you have the floor, this might be a good opportunity just for you to briefly remind people, since we're talking about anger and protest, that I guess 3.5 decades ago or so, no, probably more than that, maybe almost 4 decades ago or so, this community declared itself English only because it was because a lot of people were unhappy with what appeared to be favorable conditions being provided for French language speakers. And it was David Peterson's government, the former Liberal Premier of Ontario, who put forward a bill which would have provided extra services for French language people where numbers warranted, and a lot of people were unhappy about that. Fast forward, you're now the mayor. You and your council have decided to do something about that.
Well, it's been a sore point, to be honest, for Francophones. I see some Francophones in the audience today, in fact, some local Francophones. It's been a sore spot for Francophones in the community for 34 years. It was 34 years ago this past January. And it was something that, though our previous mayor, John Roswell, apologized for the actions of one of his predecessors, there was this sense that the French community was never really accepted as part of the broader Sault Ste. Marie community, at least at the municipal level, right? So from the time I was elected, I got that sense. I'm the first French-speaking mayor to be elected in the Soo, and so I had that interaction with Francophone members of the community and got that sense that they were still feeling like second-class citizens in their own community when it came to the municipal government. So my council, I'm grateful that they agreed to pass a resolution to extend Francophone services to the community at City Hall, so that if someone comes into City Hall and is a Francophone, they will now be able to access services in their maternal language.
Is there much of a backlash to that?
There wasn't, because I think the community had moved on from it long ago, but there was never the closure from the Francophone community that I felt that they needed in order to feel like they were equal citizens within our City Hall. So I was eager to right that historical wrong.
Gotcha. Yes, please.
So you've talked about anger and the anger that leads to rage? What about the anger that leads to apathy? Like how, when people feel so powerless, how do you battle the apathy? How do you get citizens engaged? How do you get them working towards the common good?
I don't know who wants to jump in on this, but I can, just to follow up on what you've said there, if there's one thing I hear from citizens, probably more than any other criticism, it's that it's impossible to get a hold of a politician anymore on the phone. Because there's no phones anymore, right? There's no phones at Queen's Park anymore. You can only leave a voicemail. You can't actually get somebody on the other end of the phone. And that leads to apathy. They throw their hands up and they say, I can't get anywhere. I don't know. I guess they can engage each other, but trying to actually get a politician on the other end of the phone is a bit of a problem. I don't know. You want to jump in on that, Sabrina?
Yeah, sure. I think with this increasing pressure to pick a side, most people are just taking a step back because these just aren't the conditions under which they feel they can do anything productive. One way forward could be through citizens' assemblies, which have existed for a long time and are on the rise, and there have been hundreds just in recent years that have been used to randomly select citizens, support them, and engage them in making meaningful and substantive recommendations to shape policy as it relates to anything from like end-of-life care to climate change. And this is about having that connection with citizens, being able to hold institutions to account beyond the election cycle. And you know, this has been very successful in Europe, and it's really helped people feel that it's about their voice, not just their vote, and how that increasingly has become transactional and kind of empty, and you know, I only hear from you when you need me kind of thing. But the Citizens Assembly model, you know, offers a productive way forward, and it can be a way to get that, repair the relationship between the political establishment and the citizenry. And it's also just about responsiveness and respect. If people are at 10 with their rage, they want to feel heard. They want to feel respected, you know, and they want to see some sort of response.
You know what? I don't want to sound like a cynic here, because I'm not, but we did try this almost 20 years ago in Ontario as it related to changing the voting system.
Right.
And a citizens' assembly was struck by the government of the day. A bunch of people came together. They did really good work. They brought in experts. They took their responsibilities seriously. The government took their report and did nothing on it. Never mind didn't implement it, did nothing on it.
But
Zero.
Steve, we can't be...
Put it to a referendum, but didn't campaign. Didn't do any campaigning on it.
We can't be one and done. Like, democracy is important. It's a struggle. It's going to be hard. But you know what? It's dynamic, and it can evolve. If something didn't work the first time, like, lick your wounds, get out there and do better.
Try again. Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Aiden. I'm from the Sault, and I want the panel to, my question is to examine the potential risks associated with unchecked anger in the context of citizenship. How can excessive or uncontrolled anger undermine democratic values and institutions?
That's a big question. Well done. Okay. Yes, please. Diane, that had your name written all over it.
It did. Like, did you read my book or something? No, seriously, because I actually, when I began a civility tour 6 years ago, and at the time, it wasn't as though we did have big problems with civility, but we were not very conscious of we felt that culture was something that happened to us as opposed to something that flowed from the actions that we tolerate and accept. And to a large extent, you know, President Trump was in power at that time, and we were blaming whatever toxicity we saw in the public square on external forces as opposed to what's happening to us locally. But what I could see clearly was that there was already a erosion. So toxic culture, you know, like what does it actually mean? Like, how does it manifest in a community? What it manifests as is values like might is right. These are coercive values. They're authoritarian values that are not democratic. When you want to get your way, and you're going to do it by scapegoating people or by undermining their dignity, undermining their safety, coming after their family members, ruining their reputations, you no longer have a democratic culture. That is something that belongs like in medieval Europe or something, right? And so what ends up happening is that gets targeted at local governments, and we see this mass resignations. We have a rise in elections by acclamation. We have a decrease in the diversity of voices and people running because the more socially secure you are, the less likely you are to subject yourself to the politics of the snake pit. You see enormous amounts of money being spent. Like it's at a time when our municipalities are so tight budgeted to deal with, for instance, CAO turnover, like the chief administrative officers that are the stable administrative force that is so essential, because elections mean that the political leadership is changing regularly. Like this came to us from feudal Europe, where regime change wasn't by election, it was by murder. So they were concerned that if they got killed, they needed the city to function. So they created a stable bureaucracy out of magnanimity, out of care for their community. And yet our city managers no longer, it used to be like a 20-year gig, now they've gone down to about 2 to 3 years. A city manager job rarely lasts an entire term, which causes enormous organizational instability. So we all end up losing out, not to mention, recruitment costs, replacement costs. We have municipalities that are going through a shortage of people in the sector. Some municipalities are turning over 800-900 employees within the next 2-3 years, and there's nobody to replace them. So the impacts on service delivery, imagine some of our municipalities, even in Ontario, have third-party reports showing harassment against civic workers, the frontline employees being up to 50%. And that's from all directions, like each other, the public, to them, they're, vertically within the organization. And just imagine, like, these are unionized workplaces. You're talking grievances, settlements, sick leave. That's all impacts the community service delivery. So this kind of act of getting your way is profoundly selfish and destructive when you consider the consequences. We all lose collectively. So there really is one way forward, and it's finding a way to revive the art of living and working well together. And I'm glad you actually called it a risk. I encourage municipalities to create like a sort of dummy line item to just calculate how much money is being spent when a vexatious citizen comes in and makes 1,000 complaints about the same thing, or just, the intention is simply to tear down. There's like a lust for destruction. And if we tear down our democratic institutions, well, we better have something else in mind to replace them with, because we haven't seen a better system yet.
I thought Churchill said it was the worst system
yes,
ever,
indeed.
except for everything else.
Except for everything else, that's right, exactly.
Got it. Okay, you're going to finish us off tonight. Go ahead, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kevin. I'm a student here in Sault Ste. Marie.
Which post-secondary institution?
Algoma University.
Great.
Yeah. I wanted to offer an issue that generates a lot of anger and a potentially interesting solution for this community, directed at our mayor, but if any other panelists, feel free to weigh in. Just the housing issue. A solution I feel that would be interesting for this community is shared living, or like intergenerational living. There are a lot of seniors in our community with like spare rooms, and they feel lonely, or there's like a lack of community, lack of third spaces, as you mentioned. And I feel like intergenerational living or shared housing, specifically intergenerational living, because I feel that sharing rooms with or sharing a space in your house or apartment or wherever with specifically young workers or students, especially in our community, because we have such a great student population with Algoma and Sault College. And of course, I think I said we already have a disproportionately elderly community. I wanted to ask what role or what help do you think the provincial or municipal government might be able to offer that kind of solution, either in like subsidies or some kind of promotion, or good algorithm to run the matching for these things, and also what communities might be able to do to encourage this kind of thing and alleviate the problems that people are suffering from lack of decent housing.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Just before you answer, actually, Frisco, for those who are watching us outside of Sault Ste. Marie, around the rest of the province, I think we've all heard a lot about what the housing situation is like in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, in Ottawa, etc. Just give us the lay of the land here. What's it like?
Well, it's still one of the most affordable places in the province to buy a house. I think part of what's happened is the city report recently talked about how a lot of housing here, the 3-bedroom houses are still occupied by one person. That's a big issue in Sault Ste. Marie. A lot of people who are elderly are still living at home. They're allowed to. That's one issue. But we have had an issue here of people who have seen Sault Ste. Marie as an opportunity to invest in lower end housing, and they're buying up housing by the hundreds. And we see it, so there's, you know, multiple out-of-town shell companies that own hundreds and hundreds of houses in Sault Ste. Marie, including dozens and dozens that are just left boarded up on the hope that one day they'll flip them for a little more money. And that's not helped with the housing crisis here. And to the city's credit, they've worked hard to enforce bylaws, property standards bylaws, to try to do everything they can to deal with these landlords or these property owners. But the reality is, you're allowed to buy houses, and these guys have done this. And now we've seen one of them, for example, is in creditor protection. And in the court documents, they talk about how these guys own the most houses in Ontario. They're the single largest homeowner in Ontario, this company. It's been an awful thing for the community.
Okay. You've heard, Your Worship, the idea from Kevin. Is there anything the city can do to facilitate?
Yeah, I mean, Frisco mentioned the report that we had about 3-bedroom houses. I think it's about 3,000 to 3,600 houses in the Soo that have, you know, one person living in them, but it's a multi-bedroom home. So it's an excellent way to unlock the potential of you know, someone's house to create more housing. What it requires is a couple things. First off, a change in culture, because most people who live in these 3-bedroom houses are used to living in a 3-bedroom house and nobody disturbing what they want to do within their 4 walls. So I think the province and the municipality are trying to push the message, and the federal government largely are trying to push the message that housing is a need across the country. And so anybody that can contribute to resolving the housing issue should be incentivized to do that, including folks who are who are underutilizing the space in their house. But the other aspect of it, I think, is that there is a sense of security in your house. And so if you are hearing all this stuff about how polarized the world is becoming and how dangerous it is becoming, then I think you are less likely to open your door to your neighbor and offer up space that you might otherwise feel safer leaving empty. And so that is, I think, the task of, you know, good community to show that opening the door to your neighbor is a positive thing and not a risk, and that there's some work to do on that portfolio.
Kevin, my suggestion is talk to Ali. She'll tell you how to set up a Facebook friends group. You can make some progress that way.
Yeah, sure. I don't want to say it's all the government's job. There's definitely the community has to open its doors.
There we go. Thank you for the question. And that's our time, everybody. I just want to thank all of the members of this audience for coming tonight and for your participation in the Q&A. I want to thank our wonderful crew, who I hope have been on camera at some point in this evening's festivities, for doing such a great job to get all the equipment from Toronto up to here, set up, looking so good. Well done, guys. That was terrific. A huge thank you to the people here at the Loft of the Algoma Conservatory of Music. You have been an absolute delight to deal with. We couldn't have done any of this without the support of our friend Red Wilson and the Wilson Foundation. It's made the entire TVO Today live series possible, allowing us to have conversations about our democracy all over the province of Ontario. So that's been great. For past and future programs in this series, there is a website you can go to check it out. It's tvo.org/TVO Today Live. Or go to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/TVO Today. And finally, last but not least, I know you all want to join me in thanking our guests for coming this evening: Matthew Shoemaker, Sabrina Dellin, Joel Surrett, Diane Kalen-Sukra, Michelle McCleave-Kennedy, and Michael Friscolanti. How about a nice hand for all of them for coming in this evening as well? Thank you. We appreciate you coming out tonight. I'm Steve Paikin. Thank you and good night from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Great job. Well done, everybody. Great job.